Hey, welcome back to the Underground Sound. This is John Kavnar with Daniel Walsh, and we got special guest Moses McPherson. How's it going, Moses?
Good, thank God. How are you guys doing?
Real good, real good.
Good, brother.
Hey, so why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself, Moses?
Yeah, start off from like the start.
What do you yeah, what do you guys want to know specifically?
All the way back. So were you born in Texas? You live
No,
in
actually,
Texas, but were you born there?
Yeah, I was born in Canada, actually.
Okay.
In Ontario, Canada, and my dad was a pastor. We moved to California, which is where he was from, when I was 9 years old. And so I grew up most of my life in Southern California. Oddly enough, my dad's dad and his family are from Texas. And so when I was a wee 2 months old or so, we came to Texas as the first place I ever came. So, yeah, but most of my life, I grew up, lived in Southern California. I went back to Canada with my wife in our early 20s for undergraduate, and then eventually, did an MDiv, and, we've had various assignments within the Orthodox Church since then, and now we're in Texas. So,
Okay.
yeah, it's funny enough, though, I was talking, you'll appreciate this, Daniel, I was talking to somebody the other day, and their family's from Texas as well, and they have McPhersons here in Texas that they're related to. And so, and the McPhersons in Texas are like real Scottish, like my ancestry is like almost, I can't remember what it is, right? I think it's like 60% Scottish or something like that. And so I actually have Scottish from both sides, from my mom's side, from the McDonald's, and then from my dad's side, McPherson's, obviously. But McPherson's I guess, people have told me that they've seen placards or whatever in the oil field area from the McPhersons who work down there. So, yeah, oddly enough,
And like
Scotsmen's in Texas. Pardon?
The Scots and Irish people are very close. We've always been very close.
Mm-hmm.
Like
Yeah.
I've come here from Ireland, and we're pretty close in a lot of things. Yeah.
My wife and I went to Scotland on our honeymoon, to Ireland on our honeymoon, and we were there for.
Oh, nice.
I think we were there for like 11 days. Anyways, we always told everybody like the Irish are the friendliest people in the world, like unbelievably friendly people, just delightful. So yeah,
That's cool.
That's good to hear.
yeah.
That's good to hear, man.
And everybody's like, "Oh, you're from America. Where are you from? Oh, I know so and so. They live in America as well, And so it's like, yeah, it's the Irish are very hospitable towards Americans. The Scottish are the Scottish are a little rougher around the edges. They're not as refined as the Irish.
That's funny. Now we were just talking, actually, me and Daniel, about our heritage and stuff. And growing up, I always thought I was like 50% Irish. And I actually talked to my aunt, my older aunt, and she told me, "No, sweetheart, you're like 30% Scottish and like 8% Irish." So,
right.
Changed everything up. I got this big clover leaf on my arm and stuff. She's like, "You're barely any Irish at all, sweetie."
Yeah, I mean, I have a little bit of Irish, but it's interesting because you get your DNA in weird ways. Like it's you kind of think like, well, if my mom was 100% Italian and my dad was 100% Scottish, I'd be 50-50. But the reality is, it's like your DNA comes to you however. And when you actually do a DNA test, you find out that you have, I have 20% of my DNA, 19% of my DNA is from my dad's mom, and that's not from anybody else in the family. She was European Jew, and my DNA came back like 19% European Jew, and she's the only one. And so you just you have no idea. I mean, there's nobody else in the family that I even know would have any of that DNA, but you just get it how you get it. So anyways, yeah.
That's a trip. Yeah. DNA and genetics are, man, they're a trip. So.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
How long have you been involved with the church now?
So, do you guys want me to start you kind of like early?
Wherever you're comfortable. Yeah.
Sure. So, my dad was a pastor. We grew up And, you know, we had to be honest, we had a very tumultuous family life. And the presentation of the family on Sunday morning was very different than the private presentation of the family. You know what I mean? And so, you know, I'm not here to, you know, call anybody out or, you know, reveal everybody's, you know, problems and sins and shortcomings. I certainly have my own, but in terms of family life, it was very tumultuous. And, you know, because of that, you know, people often said like, oh, did you rebel? You know, and to be honest with you, like, if anything, I rebelled against God. I didn't really rebel against my family because everything was so dysfunctional. It wasn't like I had this like, forgive me, but I didn't have like this peaceful, loving, healthy environment where I was being nurtured. And then all of a sudden I said, oh, you know what? I can't stand this. I got to go get loaded. It was that I had such a tumultuous, anxiety producing existence that eventually I was like, I can't do this. I couldn't hang. And so, you know, right around the age of 14 or so is when I started drinking and started smoking pot really heavily. And when I started doing that, I was finding, you know, I was not finding obviously a spiritual solution to my life, you know, but I was finding a solution, which was when I got
Yeah.
high, I didn't feel anxiety. I didn't feel depressed. And
Yeah, you didn't have to face those kinds of emotions as much. It was
yeah,
like a mask.
yeah. And so, you know, the family life was, you know, the family life was crazy, to be honest. You know, it was crazy. And so that was what was kind of keeping me um, you know, keeping me grounded for a little while. But, you know, it's kind of like the saying, you know, when you give the devil an inch, he becomes your ruler. And so what started out as trying to self-medicate and just trying to make it quickly turned into, you know, really full-blown, obviously addiction, very self-destructive.
Right.
And, you know, everything went off the rails, you know. And so what was helping me with, you know, anxiety at first quickly became, you know, debilitating depression and just insanity. You know, really lucky to be alive. I mean, I have friends, I have close friends who are no longer alive, and close friends who
Yeah.
went to prison, and you know, that's the path that I was headed on. I didn't have another way in life. I didn't see another path, or probably maybe more accurately, I really wasn't willing or ready to bow the knee. And
It's
you
very
know,
early, like it's very young to go through that kind of a struggle, to start facing addictions and masking your issues with things and trying to get rid of certain feelings to deal with life. That's a very young age to find that path.
yeah, I think so. I mean, you could, yeah, but it was so normal. Like that was, you know,
It's
everybody I
normal to you
knew,
though. Yeah,
yeah, everybody I knew lived like that. So it was, you
yeah.
know, a lot of people, not everybody, but a lot of people that I knew lived like that. And it was so commonplace that um, it seemed like a natural decision. But for me, you know, it became ever more expansive. You know, the addiction didn't have any boundaries. And like probably like most people who get into weightlifting, whatever else, you tend to have a more, maybe you want to call it robust personality, where you like to take things to greater levels of extreme, and you know, you want to
Yeah.
kind of taste all of life, and so that's how it was for me, and I ran that really hard. um so, you know, when I was 17, my parents, it was right after my 17th birthday, they had, you know, just called the police on me for some stuff. And, you know, it was all pretty crazy. And they, they actually had me kidnapped and taken, or escorted. Escorted is probably a more accurate term. They had me escorted to a military boys' home in Mississippi. And so when I was 17, I ended up there. And it was,
Right.
I mean, it was, uh, I'll give you a little backstory. So the guy who came and got me in the morning, he said, hey, we're going to take you to this facility. You know, don't try to run. You know, one way or the other, you're coming with me. And we're going to Mississippi, but it's a great facility. They have counselors. They have, you know, good food. It's, you know, going to get you back on track. It's going to, you know, help you. It's faith-based. And at the time, I was like, I was so beat and I was so depressed on life. And I was just kind of at the end of my existence mentally. and spiritually. I didn't really have anything to lose. I was like, I don't want to go there, but I don't have anything here that I'm missing out on. And there was like a little glimmer of hope for me. This idea, like, I'll go there and it will get good. And so on the way there, the guy was great. We went to LAX and he got me cigarettes and let me smoke all day. And so we flew from LAX to Mississippi and went and got food and all this. And I was like, you know what? It's not going to be that bad. And we we drive down this dirt road at like, I don't know, 9 o'clock, 10 o'clock at night. It's pitch black in the middle of nowhere called Lucedale, Mississippi.
Right.
And we're driving down this path, and on my left, there's this giant cinder block barracks, building, just a rectangle cinder block barracks. And I'm like, oh, okay, it's not real fancy, whatever, And I remember we turn a left around the front of the barracks, and there's a stairwell on the outside of the building. And there was 2 dudes there underneath the light, and one of them was wearing cami pants and a white shirt and cami boot and military boots. And I saw them, and I was like, I immediately knew. I was like, oh, this is not what he said it was going to be. And so, they take me down to kind of the reception area, which was kind of an front entryway of this guy's house. This guy had a giant house on the property, and then they had the barracks, and they had a chow hall and all this. And so we go in there, and I had my ears pierced, and these guys are good old boys from the South, and they're like, what's wrong with you, boy? You a faggot, boy? You a faggot? They start getting in my face, and my whole mind was like, you got caught slipping. You trusted that guy. You got caught slipping. And so anyways, they took me back to the barracks and it was all crazy. They were looking at me and they're like, you want to throw down, And I'm like, there's like 4 guys. I'm like, I'm not going to throw down. I'm like, basically, loaded out of my mind all the time. I'm like 5'6", maybe 145 pounds sopping wet. I'm like, we go back to the barracks and they shave my head bald, shower me, and then, throw me in this bunk bed, this rack, and the top floor of the barracks. I go in there at night. There's one person sitting at a desk, doing night watch, and everybody else is in their racks. And I just know this is gladiator school. Like this is not some therapeutic self-help, get well, do therapy, eat well type of facility. And so they throw me in the rack. I don't know what time it was, 11, 12, 1 a.m., something like that. It's pretty late. And I just remember, man, I laid in that rack and I just started praying, man. It was like real serious, honest prayers. Because I kind of knew like this is not a survivable situation. This is not a real thing that you just kind of get out and you just kind of man your way through. And so 5 a.m., man, flip on the lights, and then they start yelling to get online. Everybody jumps out of their racks. Everybody lines up, and that's it, man. It's battle school. So the whole place was set up, and they eventually had, I think it was the first month or 2 that I was there. They didn't have him, but they had previously had a drill instructor from the Marine Corps. His name was William Knott, Knott. You can read about him online. He just was federally indicted and sentenced for another facility that he was part of. And he was the drill instructor that had kind of laid a lot of the groundwork. And so we hop out online. We're in our boxers, t-shirt, and then you make your rack. And then it's just for the first, whatever it was, I can't remember if it's the first week or 2, but you were on orientation. And so they would just wear us out all day, every day. And I remember, it was Mississippi in September. And I remember vomiting like fluorescent green, like not human colors, like just unbelievable vomit all the time. And there was no medical help, medical assistance. One of the guys who was in the orientation unit with me, was constantly complaining about his ribs because his ribs were broke because he he tried to break out, and they had kicked him in the ribs when they caught him again, and he was all jacked up, and he was always talking about his ribs. He actually eventually got out, and they did an X-ray, and his ribs were broken. So we're going through this crazy. We're running hills. We are, doing pain trains, where you put your hands on each other's shoulders and squatting in a line up and down and doing duck walks, and you're just doing stuff all day, and just, again, trying not to throw up, and people are constantly screaming in your face, and it was just crazy, man. And so that was kind of the beginning. Brutal. Yeah, that was the beginning of, like, it ended up being, for me, 4 months that I was there. There were guys there who had been there a lot longer than me. It's a minimum 6 month stay, but 4 months into it, I was doing really well. And my grandfather died, and so they ended up bringing me back home for the funeral. And I mean, by the time I was going back for the funeral, bro, there was no way I was going back. So they didn't know that, but that really was the end of my journey there. But I mean, the biggest thing was for me was, I mean, it was crazy. I mean, it was hellish. I mean, multiple guys that I was there with ended up in psych wards. People, one guy jumped off the second floor at one point. This was right before I showed up. He was there while I was there, and tried to kill himself. And people obviously, I mean, I think it's just a foregone conclusion, whether it was diagnosed or undiagnosed. Pretty much every dude who was there ended up with severe PTSD, because it was the wear outs, it was the exercising, it was the physical abuse, it was unbearable. I mean, especially, they had kids there as young, I think, as 12 years old. Oh. And you basically was 12 to 18. And obviously, once you turned 18, you would have to be graduated out of the program. And people were there for various lengths of time. But yeah, I mean, just the mental, psychological trauma of being not just incarcerated, but in a place that was, you called your parents once a week. They listened in during the phone call. I mean, the long story short was I ended up getting bounced out of there back to California. And it wasn't that much longer after I was gone, maybe a year and a half. And the boys rioted and burned part of the place down. And CPS came in and, like, took the boys out of there. And like I said, this character drill instructor ended up at a different facility. He was later arrested and charged federally with child abuse. But what were the things that they would do? I mean, they would, he would sick his pit bull on you, and you'd have to try to outrun the pit bull and get up on your rack, before the pit bull tried to bite you. People would, one of the things that happened, I think this was after my time too, which was, people would have to hold on to the electric fence, ride the lightning. I mean, drill instructor Knott would come up and just attack you out of nowhere and just, give you a dead leg or hit you in the side of the head with the forearm, you know what I mean? And it just all this, really just,
sounds like proper scumbag.
Yeah, well, I mean, it was, I don't know how to put it. It was devastating for me as a person. It kind of like, it changed me in ways I never, obviously could imagine and would not wish on anybody. Right. So when I was there, I mean, probably the biggest thing for me was I was in the middle of this psychologically tumultuous turmoil, physical abuse, not sleeping enough, everything that goes on. We would box. I mean, I got concussed one time. I got concussed so hard that we were playing football, but they had us do tackle football, and one of the guys, a huge guy, plowed me down and cussed me so hard I like woke up inside the building. Oh, wow. Like I had been concussed out on the field and woke up inside the building. And then when you tell them, they give you some ibuprofen. And then when you tell them, like, man, I think like my head is like not functioning right. They were like, you'll be fine, and I was out of it for 2 or 3 days, just gnarly concussion, just
That's insane.
very, very bad concussion. And
That's insane.
I remember one time that I was sick and they had me in my rack and they thought that I was faking. So I had to get out of my rack and go box another guy
Oh
and,
man.
and to prove that I wasn't actually sick. And, it was, it's just like anything. It was kind of it was a mixed bag, I mean, there was the one half of it that was, absolutely tumultuous and devastating. There's so many adjectives you could use. They're all just negative, right? Then there was the other aspect of it that, dude, I prayed. I prayed a lot when I was in there. I read my Bible a lot and I prayed a lot. And I had a lot of real prayers, and
Do you think
prayers
it's your
from
faith is what got you through?
well, and the
I
thing
think
was,
your
is
faith
that
is what got you through.
it wasn't like, it's a weird thing, but it wasn't like belief that got me through. It was like there were times when I was there that I could just feel the presence of God. And I would feel totally peaceful, man. I'd be in the midst of just absolute psychological crushing, insanity and screaming and physical, exhaustion and all this. And I would feel peaceful and I would be like forgiving. And, I went through and I watched other guys would go through this. There was guys that would go through this. They would become like hard and just bitter and angry. I remember a whole period when I was there, when I was like vowing to myself that I would come back and burn the place down and like hurt people and all that, you know what I mean? And
Yeah.
and I realized, you go through an event like this and either you are like damaged severely. There's no gray area. Either you're like severely damaged or you somehow come out of it not undamaged, but just different. And that was the biggest thing for me, man. It was that I prayed and that I genuinely felt the presence of God. And I felt like, God was with me. And I had, there were times there that I had the most unbelievable peace that I'd ever experienced in my life. All these times of, drugs and alcohol and everything that is involved with that. And you're chasing after that feeling of like wholeness, of peace, of, contentment. Like you're chasing that something, that just feeling right. And with drugs, it's like you're never quite there. You're always like, you're trying to find it. And there were moments that I was there where I was like, look, everything externally in my life is wrong, but internally, I feel all right. Like I don't feel bad. Like I feel, for the first time in my life, I feel okay. And those it wasn't like I lived on like a cloud when I was there. It wasn't like that at all. I mean, it was constant everyday grind that was extremely grueling. But I went through that, and I found as time went on, I became less dependent on God. I became, as we often do, right? We kind of get our sea legs underneath us and we begin to kind of process the situation, and we're not as afraid as we were, when I was first there. I mean, I was like life or death afraid. Like, this type of place, you could die and like nobody will care, right? There's like, you could die accidentally here. And but as time went on, I kind of got my sea legs and I felt more comfortable, and I became less serious about prayer. I became less serious about, reading the scriptures, and I just became less dialed in. And by the time that I left there, I left and I kind of was like, all right, I think I'm doing better. I think I got this from here. And that's the weirdest part, is that you can go through and have an absolutely profound spiritual experience and then just not come to the end of yourself. Like you're just still like, you often think like, there's a great saying, I don't know where it originally came from, but they say, there's a throne on your heart and only one person can sit there. And you're constantly like, you'll give the throne to Christ and you'll be like, you can sit there and I'll worship you. And then a couple of days go by and things go wrong or whatever, or things aren't going the way you want them to. And then you're like, time out. Let me sit there for a minute. Let me figure this out. Let me take control of this. You know what I mean? And I
Yeah.
think very much it was like that. I really put Christ on the throne of my heart. And then by the time that I left, I was like, I think I've got this kind of figured out. I think I can manage my life. And it's good to know that you're there. But, you know, I still want to be me. And I still want my life. And so I left there and I didn't go back into my life the same way that I previously had been living it, but I went back into it. And
Yeah.
when I went back into my old life, I just encountered just more. It was like the internal lowness that I felt was unbelievable. It was like worse than it had ever been before. And not only that, but I obviously had, again, I've never been clinically diagnosed, but I obviously had severe PTSD symptoms. So I couldn't, people couldn't touch my face. If you touch my face, you know, I could not handle it. I failed to moderate between like anger and life and death. And so everything for me was like, I didn't have a middle ground anymore. Like, oh, that person did something that offended me and I didn't like that. It was like I was so institutionalized that everything became like, oh, this is worth dying over. Like this dude wants to go to war. And my mind, I couldn't differentiate. It was just, I mean, I was like constantly in the red all the time. And you know, I'm having these terrifying nightmares every night about being locked up again. So every day I'm waking up and I'm just have, you know, my mental state is just crap, you know, and I don't know what all's going on. I'm thinking some of this stuff is normal. I remember talking to a buddy of mine who was a really close friend of mine before I went in there. And he said, you know, when you came out, you know, you were just changed. You just changed and you know you weren't as playful as you used to be. You weren't as like happy-go-lucky as you used to be, you know, because I was kind of a joker and a bit of a, you know, I could be a goofball and I could have fun and then I came out and my disposition was so different and the way that I saw life really was so different. You know, that's one of the hallmarks of PTSD, right, is that you're constantly in the red. You constantly feel like you need to be on like danger alert and you're constantly fight or flight. Yeah. So I was living like that all the time. Anxiety, yeah. Sorry, Daniel, you were saying?
No, I just said, yeah, I know what you're saying. Your anxiety is high. You're constantly in this fight or flight feeling, you know, and yeah, it's no way to live, especially when you're feeling that every day.
And like you were saying, it's hard to differentiate. Like it's hard to say, wait a minute, this isn't that big a deal. Let it work its course out. You're like, oh no, this got to be handled right now. Like you said, life or death, and you can't really, you know, differentiate.
Well, and I mean, you get into a little argument with a coworker, and all of a sudden in your mind you're like, let's throw down. You know, you're like, we'll brawl right here behind the counter in front of the customers if we have to. And other people are like, what? Like, you know, they're like, I just wanted to say something rude to you, you know, in their mind, they're like, what are you tripping out? And so my whole disposition, everything was pretty out of whack, very much so. And, you know, I went back into that old life, you know, smoking pot a lot and then, you know, starting to drink more than I had. And, you know, the thing is that I just couldn't hang. Long story short is I had this girlfriend that I was really serious about. And, you know, I thought, man, this is it. I'm going to get married. And then, you know, obviously it blew up and she cheated on me and I was devastated. And all of a sudden it just felt like my life was just hitting like lower lows than I had ever experienced.
Yeah.
And at this time I was like, look, I'm spiritual, but I'm not like Christian religious type. And I started, you know, it's the funniest thing, man, is that my mom gave me this book that was by this woman named Anne Lamont, I think is how you spell her last name. And she's like you know, I would never recommend her book in a million years. Okay. She's like like I have nothing theologically in common with her, et cetera, et cetera. And I don't condone her writings or her theology, but I was reading this book and she was saying things in there that I was like, man, maybe like on some level I need Christ back in my life. And so I started going to the local Protestant church and I just was hanging out there. I wasn't becoming a Christian. I would just go to some services and I was like, I was doing introspection. That's what it was. I mean, I remember waking up in the morning and having these nightmares and I was doing introspection and I was looking at my life and I'm like, it's the weirdest thing, but it's undeniable. The best I have ever mentally felt was when I was locked up. And it was a freaky thought because I was like, everything in my life was wrong. And yet it was the best I ever felt mentally. Like moments, not like every day, 24/7. Like it wasn't, a magical cloud that I just sailed through this traumatic event. But I had moments in there that were so crisp. And I still remember some of them to this day where everything just was so tranquil. And I couldn't understand that because I could not find that in the world. I couldn't find that in my freedom. And so I started hanging out with this Christian group and they were just kind of, non-denominational folk and started going to services. People were super welcoming and kind and friendly to me. And I enjoyed it. I enjoyed my time with them. And there was just a series of things that happened. There was a series of things that had happened even before then that I started realizing like, there is really only Christ and the devil. There's no multiple religion, multiple path to God. There's not a spirituality that you can have where Christ is not king. I'm like, none of that stuff exists. There's either Jesus Christ or the devil. And to be honest with you, I had experienced the devil when I was out there in the world, when I was doing drugs and everything else. I mean, I had some very profound experiences that were undeniable. There was undeniable evil as a presence. And I had tried to play the game where like I could kind of sit on the throne, to use that analogy, and I could have my spirituality, but I realized it was crazy because what ended up happening was my spirituality was just everything that I thought, whatever I wanted to do. And in that sense, it was completely satanic, right? Because, it's like, Aleister Crowley says, do what thou wilt should be the whole of the law, right? And so as long as you're not hurting anybody and all this other stuff. But I was like, man, I make a mess of life. I can't hang. I can't function. And I'm not good for me or anybody. And so through that process, I just, I don't know what all happened. I don't know if there was a specific moment, but I just realized like, there's people, maybe there's somebody, I don't know if there's somebody who can live without Christ. Obviously, I don't think that there is, but I became completely convinced that I could not exist without Jesus Christ in my life. And it wasn't even by a small margin. I mean, it was really the core of me is very self-destructive and can get all kinds of twisted without him. And I realized like, I can't function. I can't function without him in my life. So it was on such a deep, and it was just on a very deep level. And I think, let's say that was when I was 18. I was probably, I was in my 18th year. I went to the boys' home right when I turned 17, came back 4 months later, and I lived that life for another year, maybe in a bit, and then started going to church. And then, that was kind of it. That was the beginning of that process. I don't think that there's like that. You always want that aha moment, that mountaintop moment, and it doesn't exist. The Christian life is an absolute grind. It's a grind. It's been I'm 40 now. It's been 22 years I've been grinding at it. And it's
is that like sanctification? Like the grind?
Yeah, I mean, we call it theosis, the process of becoming Christ-like, becoming, God-like. Yeah, that's that process, and it's and yeah, I mean, that was where it started. And so I was 18, went to the evangelical church, realized that I was reading, the New Testament. I read the whole Bible in the first year. I read the New Testament multiple times that first year. And I really threw myself into understanding the faith, because I was like, I've been so tricked and so deluded. I need to know what it is that we believe. Like, I need to know what it is that we believe. And so, I started seeing the first cracks at that point, problems. One of which was I was reading the book of Acts, and I'm seeing all these miracles and all this grace of the Holy Spirit and all these things happening. And then I'm looking around and I'm like, what is going on? Like, why don't we look like the book of Acts anymore? And I'm like,
Yeah.
And so, originally I got kind of in with some Protestant group, and then, not Protestant, Pentecostal group, and then quickly realized, like,
Uh-oh. Oh man. I don't know if that's me or you guys. There we go.
I'm back.
There you go.
Is there something new?
I wonder if that's my Wi-Fi or your guys' Wi-Fi.
We still got Moses. Is Moses back yet now?
I don't know if you can hear us, Moses. Oh,
Nothing yet.
I think we lost him. Hold on one sec. I don't think I have to invite him again. He has the link. Hold on one sec, buddy.
If anyone there is listening still to this, please do me a favor, us a favor, like, share, and sub. Leave a comment if you have that's on your mind. Any questions or topics that you'd like to speak about or hear us speak about, just drop a comment down.
all right, we're back.
There he is. Yeah.
We've got a crazy windstorm here. So all the power in the building just went out.
Oh man.
Oh really? Yeah.
I was like worried. I was like, man, are the kids using the Wi-Fi? Like, I got up real quick to make sure nobody's using anything, but they all left. So I'm glad we figured it out. Oh, did you freeze again? Oh, you froze again.
Did he?
Yeah. I thought he was just looking at me really, like, concentrating, but I think it froze. Oh man.
We can always
Big windstorm.
Edit this bit of him.
Yeah, he's good at editing, so he can edit it out. That stinks.
We may not be able to get him back on here now if his power's going to keep
If his power keeps going out, yeah.
It's an interesting story too.
I can message him. I know, man, and like, it's crazy. It's not crazy, but it's so interesting because it's almost like I can relate to his story so much. Like, I didn't get to go to a boys camp or anything, but I went to group homes and things. But just the way how he processed through things and his walk with his faith and stuff, it's like, whoa, it's really resonating with me. Let me
There's a couple
him
of things I'm trying to pick up from this, like especially how he was saying how it's a grind and it takes time and I like the way he said there is only Jesus and the devil. There's nothing else.
Yeah,
like that
dude.
too.
That's some truth right there. That's really
it
good.
Keeps it very simplistic right there too, right? It's right, black and white. Makes a lot of sense. And yeah, when he was talking about like how he was finding peace while he was inside that place, it was reminding me of what Scotty was saying, peace within the madness, finding peace inside the madness.
Yeah, and it's so undeniable that peace. I know in my life, dude, when situations like that, I knew there's no doubt that peace came from the Lord. You know what I mean? Because where else could it have come from? you know, in situations like that. I actually had that
Yeah,
revelation
so true.
in April. You know, when I was looking at all these things online, all those conspiracies, and just following the news a lot and everything that was going on, and I remember laying in bed and just thinking, Lord, like I'm so full of fear and life seems so chaotic. Like, what's going on? And he was just like, I felt like he spoke to my heart and said, you know, I'm the God of peace and not of chaos, you know? And it just hit me, dude. It was like, you know, I just needed to turn my direction, my focus somewhere else onto him. And then it was like
Yeah,
the peace followed, you know? So, let me
I'm
see.
still working on it.
Hey, we all are, man. It's a process. Like he was saying,
We all
the
are, right? It's a process.
theosis or something. We call it sanctification. And it's a process, bro. You know, it takes time, but that's, you know, God's not tripping, man. God's patient and loving, you know, and um, but yeah, I struggle with it too, man. Like all the time, especially my mindset, because I could get sidetracked or twisted real if I'm not careful, you know, if I'm putting my focus on things of the world, you know what I mean? And the cares of the world, I'll get it.
Yeah,
My mind can get real twisted up, or I'll start like I won't have any peace or whatever. But like I've just learned that if you focus on the Lord, if you focus on Christ, and you focus on his promises and his goodness and his plan and purpose, like if you're always thinking about that, and always, the Bible says to take every thought captive, you know, if you're constantly turning to him, like your life's going to be great, dude. You're going to be it's going to be amazing. There we go. You back, buddy? Oh, you're
Sorry, fellas.
no worries, man.
no problem, bro.
Is the picture okay, or is it all pixelated?
Yeah,
It looks
no,
pretty
it's all
good.
good.
Okay. Sorry about that. Yeah, it's so funny because like seems like anytime I do one of these, anyway, something happens with the internet. So I was not a long story short was I started going to a Protestant group to Pentecostal stuff, and then I'm reading the New Testament a lot, and I'm like, man, something's not adding up here. There's like I don't think this is what St. Paul means by speaking in tongues. And, you know, I just started doing a deep dive, just trying to understand what it was that I believed. And eventually I ended up at this kind of reformed evangelical church. And they had a lot of close ties to L'Abri Fellowship, which was founded by Francis Schaeffer. And there's a L'Abri Fellowship over in England. And so I was basically just starting to date my wife at this point. I had been Protestant for maybe 6 months or something like that, and really like identifying as a Christian, you know. And I went over to England and stayed at L'Abri Fellowship for about 2.5 months. And you study for about half of the day and then do work for the other half of the day. Great experience, wonderful time, very contemplative. But I kept running into the same problem, which was there was no kind of ultimate authority. And this was kind of became a reoccurring theme for about the next 5 or 6 years, which was I couldn't find real concrete answers. What I mean is I could find books with arguments pro and against specific topics, right? So like a simple one would have been like infant baptism. And you know, people quote the Bible this way, and then other people quote the Bible this way. And so you'd have all these discussions, but everybody was kind of left to have their own personal beliefs. And the biggest problem I had with that is I was like, I don't really think that Christianity should have a bunch of personal beliefs, a bunch of individualism. And it wasn't just one thing either. Like it was infant baptism, it was free will, predestination, even giving communion to children or speaking in tongues, whatever the issue was, there just seemed to be a multitude of opinions on it. And I couldn't find anything solid. I mean, I could find compelling arguments, and I continually found that the Reformed branch had the most compelling arguments, but they were still just that. They were just arguments. And even within the Reformed branch, then all of a sudden you ran into different arguments. You know, they weren't the same arguments, but they were still arguments that were unresolved. And so long story short is I went to L'Abri, we came back home. I ended up marrying my wife. I was, 20 years old when I married my wife, and she had just turned 21. So we were very young. And we ended up going off to college to Redeemer University College in Ontario, Canada. And I did a double major there, philosophy and religion. And it was a very good education. I mean, it was excellent. I would tell anybody that Redeemer had a fantastic education. The standards were very high. The academics were, kind of profoundly difficult. We were, always writing 10-page or 15-page papers and taking multi-hour tests. And it was very challenging in many ways. But it was also, what I was finding was that, that I was still finding that I was still very tormented by what happened at the boys' home and didn't have any resolution on that. And I still had a lot of the same problems that were bothering me. And I just didn't, I just didn't feel like, I felt like over the years from 18 to 24 or so, I felt that my understanding of Christianity as a religion had grown, but I didn't feel like my relationship with Christ had really grown. And in a lot of ways, I just felt like I was struggling with a lot of the same old sins, struggling, but just, I wasn't finding that I had the internal healing that I was looking for. And I knew it wasn't psychological. I knew that there were people who were into Christian, psychology or therapy. And I didn't feel like that there was something wrong psychologically. Now, probably there was obviously something wrong with my thinking and different things and whatever. But it was more than that. It was, I couldn't put it into words at the time, but I felt like there was so much darkness still in my soul. And I felt like I had done so much dirt in my life. Internally, I still felt very dirty. And even though I knew all the theology, like, Christ washes away your sins and et cetera, like, even though I knew the theology of, sanctification and salvation and all these different things, internally, in the depths of my soul, when I was totally silent and not with anybody else, I knew that I was a scumbag. And I knew all the stuff that I had done in my life. And it wasn't like it haunted me. It just, I knew that it was still there. And it hadn't gone away. And if you think about sin as like an illness, right? That's actually one of the main ways that it's described by the church fathers, is an illness. It's a sickness within you. I felt like I still had, it would be like a person who was like homeless and living in the gutter with tuberculosis. And you can take them out of the gutter and you can put clean clothes on them and get their hair cut and perfume them and give them a shower and everything else. And they can look different, but internally they still have tuberculosis. Like the illness is still present in them. And that's how I felt. I felt like I still had all this kind of death and decay and it wasn't psychological, and it wasn't, I can't even say, I don't know what I would describe it as. I just would describe it as sin. I just had unresolved sin in my soul that just didn't go away because I wanted it to go away, or because I said I believe in Jesus. It wasn't gone. It was still there. And I knew that it was still there. And I just found myself I wasn't becoming discontented with what I had. The problem was that I knew from my time being locked up that there was something more. I just didn't know how to get there. Like, I couldn't throw myself back into prison, right?
Yeah.
So, and that was the only way that I had ever experienced this. So there's problem number one. I don't know how to overcome that, right? So problem number two is like, well, how do you live how do you live with freedom in the free world, but still be a slave to Christ and still have that intimacy with him? And that's what it was. I felt like, look, I've been Protestant for 6 years, but I don't have the depth of my intimacy with Christ is no more than it was 6 years ago. And maybe a little, but it wasn't profound. It wasn't profound. It hadn't blossomed into anything greater. And to be honest with you, I was looking around and I had like good professors. They were salt of the earth type of guys. Like I'm not gonna put anybody down and say like, oh, they were whatever. They were good men. They went to church, they went to work, they tithed, they did whatever, they weren't jerks. You know what I'm saying? But you didn't sense, I never got the sense around people that they had a ravenous love for Christ. And I felt like when I was going to church, I was just punching the time card. Like I would go, I would sing the songs, I would do whatever, maybe have a little emotional uplift, listen to the sermon, and then I would come back and it really wasn't much changed. You know what I mean? And it'd be kind of like, I don't know, it'd be like going to the gym once a week, right? You go to the gym once a week for an hour and a half, and then you could do that for 6 months or 6 years, but you'd still look in the mirror and be like, did I make any progress? And it wasn't that I wasn't trying to live morally, right? I mean, I was married. I was trying to live morally, and I was trying to live in a holy way, but there just wasn't anything for me to grab on to take me deeper. And so two things happened that were both really profound. Number one is some of my professors were reading Catholic spirituality books. And so they turned me on to some, and it's ironic, right? I'm at a Protestant Dutch neo-Calvinist school, and guess what? There's no Calvinist spirituality books. I mean, maybe there's one, there's not a lot of reformed books on curing the heart and fasting and prayer and all this. So I just wasn't there, wasn't there. So we were like, oh, we're reading this Catholic author. And so, I started reading about the spiritual disciplines, prayer and fasting and vigil and almsgiving and all these different things. And I'm like, all right, there's something here that you can actually, put your hand to. And, I may not be whatever, but I know if you put your hand to something, you can see results. If you do the work, you can see results. And the faith became more tangible to me. And I started doing this Catholic prayer stuff every single day and started doing these meditations on Christ and blah, 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 blah. And yet I was looking at Catholicism and I was like, I'm not going to become Catholic. I'm just not. It's the wrong energy. It's just and I mean, you try to say things in a way that's not offensive, but the reality is when I looked at it, I was like, this is a very effeminate energy. This is not masculine. And I'm not trying to be a jerk by saying that. And if anybody's offended, you have my apologies in advance. But when I looked at it, I was like, this is not a hard charging masculinity. It's clean shaven, it's nice, it's soft, it's hallmark and therapeutic, and I'm like, that's not me. And it doesn't even strike me as being male. It's just not a male energy. It's not a masculine energy. And so I'm like, I'm not becoming Catholic, and there's theological reasons too, but it was a both and. And then I took this class called Light from the Christian East, Eastern Orthodoxy and Early Church History with Dr. Jim Payton, that he eventually put out a book. I think it's published by Zondervan, or I think maybe it's IVP, University Press, that published it. And it was all about early Christianity and spirituality and Eastern Orthodox Christianity. And I started reading it and I was like, oh, this is different. I've never read this before, And when you look at, if you Google Orthodox monks, it's all just gnarly, grizzled beards, black robes, living in the wilderness. It's just, it's hardcore, you know, and you read the stories and you're like, these dudes are way manlier than anybody I've ever met. Like the lifestyle that they lived with just minimal food, praying all night, thousands of prostrations. I mean, I'm like, this is a different deal, you know? I mean, you can you get the sense like this is real hardcore Christianity. This is not easy Christianity. But the thing that happened to me that was so profound was I remember reading the life of Saint Seraphim of Sarov. And when I was reading his life, I think Saint Seraphim was 19th century saint. Maybe it was 18th or 19th century. I can't remember, forgive me. But I was reading his life and he was talking to his disciple as part of one of our reading assignments. He was talking to his disciple, Motovilov, about the Christian life. And he told Motovilov, the Christian life is the acquisition of the Holy Spirit. And Motovilov said to him, what does this mean, Batushka, meaning father? And it said that Saint Seraphim's face became all bright and illumined, and the light of Christ was shining out of him, you know, like Christ on Tabor or the prophet Moses, right, when he came down from Sinai. And his face was all light, and he said he couldn't even see his face. It was like looking into the sun and seeing a pair of eyes. And I read this, and I was like, I've never read this anywhere. I've never read this in Catholicism. I certainly have never read anything like this in Protestantism. And I'm like, either this is legit, and it's like this Orthodox church has like real saints, like in the New Testament, because this is the book of Acts. This is not just different Christianity. This is the book of Acts. Nobody in Protestantism is even describing things like this. Nobody in Catholicism is even describing things like this. So either this is like true and legit, and if it's legit, there's something here, or this is all just a lie. I was like, there's not a lot of gray area, right? And it's kind of like C.S. Lewis when he talks about Christ, you know, either Christ really is God, he really is Lord, or he's a lunatic, or he's a liar, right? There's not gray area. And so when I encountered the saints of the Orthodox Church, I was like, they got that love for Christ. They have the love for Christ. It's undeniable because their life, I mean, for one, they're living these super austere lives. But for what purpose? Not so that anybody knows, because they don't make any money. They live these super austere lives because they just want to know and love Christ and be loved by him. That's it. They just want the love. They just want the intimacy with Christ. There's no angle, right? Like they don't have wives, a lot of these saints, right? Not all of them, but a lot of the saints, especially the monastics, who was what I was primarily reading. They don't have wives, they don't have money, they don't have possessions, and they're not even telling people their life story until they die.
We hopefully the power didn't go out again. Man, I was getting really into that. I was really paying attention too. It sucks that it froze right there.
Yeah, we should probably maybe even do it on a day when the storm is not there.
Yeah, because this is good, man.
Yeah.
And the guys who do the lawn just showed up, and so it's a little loud.
We should definitely.
There he is.
Back on.
I was just saying, man. I was super into what you were saying.
No. So this happens every time. If we start talking about the faith, something always goes cattywampus. So, you know, I'm reading about these guys, and I'm like, man, they have the love for Christ, man. This is legit. And I don't mean to be crass in this example, but when I was doing drugs, man, I knew a lot of people who were, you know, dope fiends and addicts. And when you meet an addict, a lot of times you meet somebody who really loves their drug. And it's a love, it's a passion. It's not a hobby. It's not, you know, something that they do on the weekends. When you meet a real addict, it's ride or die, you know, and they'll do anything. I remember I had a friend, she told me a story when she was using that she once faked appendicitis and had her appendix taken out so she could get some pills, you know?
Wow.
And it's like, you don't do that if it's a hobby. Like if it's just like a casual thing, like you don't do that type of stuff. And so when I'm reading the Saints, I'm like, this is real love because they don't care. They don't care if anybody even knows about them. They just want to know Christ.
So cool.
And it was those two things, man. And the number one thing was I felt like, you know, it's interesting. I kept thinking about that verse with the blind men who were calling out to Christ, you know, Son of David, have mercy on us. And it's like, man, Christ was so there. He was so immediate and he touched them, you know, and it was just, I don't know how I can put it, but it was like, it was perfect, right? It was like perfect. They experienced Christ. And then here I was, and I'm like, Christ, why can I not find you like this? Why can I not experience you like this? Why don't I know you like this? Like I know about you and I know of you, but I don't feel like I know you like in the depths of my soul. And I kind of felt more like a stalker, you know, like I was following after him, but I wasn't there with him. I wasn't, you know, I mean, you read St. Paul and he's like, I knew a man in Christ who ascended to the third heaven, you know, and he saw unspeakable things that a man should not tell about. And you're like, St. Paul knew Christ, man. He really knew him. And he had this exceptional intimacy with him. And I always go back to that word intimacy because I feel that that's what perfectly encapsulates the relationship that we have with God, or that we're supposed to have. You know, that it's supposed to be incredibly intimate and close. And I couldn't find that anywhere else. I just couldn't find it in Protestantism. Like I could read about a lot of different things and I could try to live a moral life, but I had two dilemmas. Number one is I couldn't know Christ how I wanted to know him. And number two was I couldn't get all the dirt out of my soul. And there was no tangible way to deal with or heal the illness of sin. And there was a lot of theology I read about sin. And you can tell yourself, like somebody could say, oh, but you were forgiven. And I'm like, I'm not arguing with you. I'm not telling you you have to agree with me or even believe me. It doesn't make a difference. It's not going to change my life. I'm telling you, no matter what I read, I had the distinct sense of the spiritual darkness and illness inside of me. And I couldn't get rid of it. And till I started reading the Orthodox saints. And then people were saying, like, this is what sin is. It's an illness. It's a darkness inside of you. And it has to be washed away. It has to be washed away through confession, through baptism first, through the sealing of the Holy Spirit, through confession, through the reception of the Eucharist. And it was all tangible and real. And honestly, like the reality is that I started staking my hope on that. Like I started staking my hope, like, look, either these are real, this is like real methodology, this is like real medicine, or it's not. But if it's real medicine, it's going to heal me, even if I don't fully get it. And I tell people that all the time. It's not like there's degrees to which we understand normal medicine, right? Like if you said, do you understand ibuprofen? I would be like, yeah, it's an NSAID, right? And it's an anti-inflammatory. And if they were like, okay, do you understand why it works? I'd be like, because your body breaks it down and uses it, you know? And I don't understand it. You know, do you understand how we make it? Do you understand how it comes to be? Do you understand like where it's manufactured and the chemical? I'd be like, I don't understand any of that, but I do understand that it works because I've taken it and it does work. And that's not faith. Like faith is not like, oh, I believe ibuprofen will work. Like I don't believe ibuprofen will work. Like I've taken ibuprofen and it works. Period. It's just a reality. I think people get twisted on faith and they make it this thing where it's like all this mental gymnastics, you know, and it's not that. Faith is not mental gymnastics. Faith is a reality. Like Christ is a person. Either you really know him or you don't. You know, I mean, there's not a lot of middle ground. If you don't know him, then it's very obvious. And if you say, I don't believe in him, it's not that you don't believe in him as an idea. It just means that you haven't encountered him. When people are like, why do you believe? I'm like, I believe because I've encountered Jesus Christ.
Because you
Not
know,
because
right?
him. That's, you know, like my whole
Yeah.
life, I've had all these experiences of him. Like, and that's what it is. It's not like, I don't struggle with that as an intellectual problem. I don't wake up in the morning and like, do I believe today? It's like, no, it's just, no. You know, it's like, do you believe in your wife? It's like, she's a person. I don't have to, you know. There is, you know, there's that direct relationship, right? And so that's the same thing, man, which is with all of this, when I came to Orthodoxy, you know, I started reading the saints. I started reading the lives of the saints. I started reading about the spiritual medicine of the church, prayer and fasting and the sacraments. And I realized that this was nothing, there was like nothing in that this was unique. None of this was new. This was all old. This was all early Christianity. This was all pre-Reformation. Church fathers were writing about this stuff all the time. The saints of the desert, you know, the desert fathers in the 3rd and 4th century were writing about this stuff. This was not like, I don't know, like, you know, some end times book that got published in 1974 or something, right? And anyways, long story short is that, you know, I started, you know, my wife and I started attending an Orthodox church. I started living the Orthodox life incrementally with prayer and fasting in a daily regimen that was structured and guided and made sense, you know, and it's interesting because, you know, we were supposed to talk about weightlifting, but even the church calendar has, you know, all these periods. It has periods of more intense fasting and less intense fasting. And it's actually set up like block periodization. Like I believe a lot of weightlifting actually works. The programming works because it's actually the same programming that the church uses on the calendar. And the way that the year is divided and the fact that like you don't run at 95% all year round. It just doesn't, it's not how the human person works, you know? And so, yeah, with all of this, you know, that was the beginning, man. That was the beginning of becoming an Orthodox Christian. And obviously, incrementally, I began to I found everything that I was looking for, you know? I mean, and not just me, I mean, my wife too. I mean, I think both of us would tell anybody that becoming Orthodox was, you know, infinitely more profound and important to us than even our marriage. And, you know, we're 20 years married and very much in love and have 4 kids. And nothing compares with the fact that we found the true faith, that we entered into the church. Everything else in my whole life is secondary to finding Christ, you know, or maybe you could say him finding me more profoundly. So, yeah.
Man, that's awesome. I was telling, you know, can you guys hear me? Or is that all messed up?
Yeah.
Okay. You know, one of the things that I had struggled with, it's crazy, man. Or it's really interesting because like I'm relating to a lot of the things you're saying. Even like when you were younger and you had to go to that boot camp, it's like, it just kind of hit me like, whoa. But like one of the journeys I had gone on, like this year, you know, after the accident, I wanted to find out more. Like because like I share with you, I've attended a lot of different denominations in my past. And one of the things that's always bugged me is, like you were saying, is everyone has a certain spin, or everyone has a certain, you know what I mean? A certain flavor or whatever you want to say. And that always bugged me because I wanted to get to the core of it. Like, what did the first century Christians believe, kind of thing? You know what I mean? Not what, you know, not what did, you know, this pastor at this, you know, Baptist or Presbyterian or whatever, what did he decide he wanted to write down today? Or what was his opinion about something? You know, my father-in-law told me a few months ago, he asked me a question. I had said something about the faith. I can't remember quite what it was. And he said, well, John, did somebody teach you that? Or did you learn that yourself? Like, did the Lord show you that? And I never had ever thought about anything like that before, and it blew me away. It made me realize, like, there's a lot of things in my journey, you know, my walk with Christ over the years that I've taken as truth because somebody said it, and not like, does that make sense? Like, not dove in and found out for myself. And I just think, I don't know, I just think that's super cool, man. I can relate to a lot of things you're saying. And I try to do a little bit of research, but on Eastern Orthodox, or is it Orthodox or Eastern Orthodox? Is it Eastern Orthodox? Oh, did you freeze again? Oh man. Stinking windstorm. That's a bummer. Hopefully Scott can edit all this stuff out. There you go. I was like, I thought I caught you in like deep thought. You know what I mean? You're like, I was like, he's thinking hard, you know? We can't hear you though.
There we go.
So I think it's really cool because I did a little bit of research on the Orthodox Church. And one of the things the priest was saying was their history of the church goes back so far, you know, like, and that's one thing that, like I said, I think it's important. Like, John Calvin is a great guy, right? You know, he loved the Lord, but to me, I want to know what first century Christians, like, what were their customs? What did they do? How did they pray? How did they meditate? How did they, like, what did their fasting look like? And through all the different Protestant denominations I've been in, it's hard to get a straight answer because you get people's opinion so many times. And it was just it was causing me to have more questions and not finding answers, you know?
Well, and I mean, I think that's like, even that's a real easy, like, here's a very easy point, which would be like the baptism of children. You know, everybody quotes the Bible, right? Like Protestantism, right? They quote the Bible and then they skip forward 1,500 years and then start quoting Luther, Calvin, the Anabaptists, you know, whatever, you know, R.C. Sproul. And you're like, you know, there was 1,500 years of Christianity before Luther came around, right? The whole presupposition of Luther is that, you know, that you have this idea of soli scriptura, by the scriptures alone. And the problem with it is that when it plays itself out, everybody's reading the scriptures and coming to different conclusions. So, like, the authority is clearly not the scriptures. The authority is the interpretation of the scriptures. So, I mean, this is why Orthodox would say, like, the Pope was the first Protestant, because the Pope split off from the Orthodox, right, in 1054, and came up with his own interpretation. And then Luther came up with his interpretation, but then within a short while, you had Calvin, Zwingli, the Anabaptists, and Luther, and they couldn't agree. And that disagreement has continued for almost 500 years. And so when you take something even, again, like paedobaptism, child baptism, you go back and read the church fathers, it's like totally obvious. There were saints who baptized their friends who were children, you know, their whole family. Like, the idea of baptizing an infant was completely normal. Like, this is not some kind of, you know, strange idea or whatever else. But the thing that was killing me at the time was I was like, I can't figure this stuff out in Protestantism, because, like, there's just, even among my professors, right? It's like, who do I pick? The most profound, the most godly, the most well-read? Like, they all have PhDs. They're all nice guys. What's the standard by which I try to figure out who is an authority? Or you say, oh no, Moses, it's just the Bible's the authority. And it's like, look, I was Protestant long enough to change, my opinion on a number of topics enough time to know that I should not be trusted as an authority or as somebody who could read his Bible on his own and come up with the right doctrine. Like, that's insanity. But the problem is, like, everybody else was doing that too. And so, you know, again, for me, it was not primarily theological why I became Orthodox. For me, I became Orthodox primarily because I wanted to grow my relationship with Christ. That's what I wanted. the theology problems and everything else that I was seeing were very secondary, but still very real. You know what I mean? Because I couldn't find the answers and I couldn't find the consistency. And I'm like, you know, God is not confusing, and he doesn't want us to be confused. And he, he doesn't have multiple personality disorder. So either he, you know what I mean? Like either he is who he says he is, or he's not. But you get into all these things, like you get into predestination, right? Like, I mean, that's a perfect one where you got one person who's like, look, God chooses who goes to heaven. Now you can debate logically whether that means that he also chooses to who goes to hell. Okay. I think that there is a logical correlation to double predestination. But or you have God who says, no, I don't choose at all, I choose everybody, which is the free will argument. But you start getting into these things, or you get into the, Calvinists who say, like, no, 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 God only loves, like, he only loves, basically part of humanity. He's only chosen for part of humanity to be saved. He could choose for everybody to be saved, but he has not chosen that. And you realize, like, these are not just questions of theology. These are questions of, like, who is God? Like, what is he like? All of these questions, they paint a picture of who he is. And they're not just theological questions that are off just, I don't know, in theology books. And I encountered that, like, when I was with the Pentecostal group and they were doing the speaking in tongues and the crazy laying on of hands and all this different stuff. There was a point where I was just like, I don't think that this is God. I don't think that this is the Holy Spirit. And there's not a lot of wiggle room. Either it really is the Holy Spirit and I am wrong, or it really is not the Holy Spirit, in which case it is either people's own flesh or it's the demons. Those are the only options. Like there's not a fourth option. Either people are like seriously deceived. Huh?
What's your opinion on demons?
and that we would have the Holy Spirit dwelling within us, that he would dwell within us and we would become like him. This is why men are greater than angels. The angels are unseen and without sin, and they literally subsist and feast on the glory of God, but they do not possess the Holy Spirit in the way that a man can and does. This is why, I mean, this is literally why the angels serve men. This is why the devil fell. Most people don't understand this. Pardon?
Is that because of free will? Like man,
it's part of it. Well, we were given a will, which God has, right?
Yeah.
That's one of the aspects. But even Saint Isaac the Syrian, he says, this is why the devil fell, because the devil looked on man and he thought that he, in his angelic state, was more glorious than man, and said that he would not serve men. And that was the beginning of the fall of the devil. And eventually, obviously, the rebellion against God was regarding the service of mankind. Because man looked, obviously, and seemed to be much less impressive than the angels. And yet it was man who could receive God within himself. In fact, it's man who becomes, this is the teaching of the Holy Fathers, it's men who become ordained, who literally possess Jesus Christ mystically dwelling within them, to the point that they are able to forgive sins, that they're able to call down the Holy Spirit upon the bread and the wine, and they transform into the body and blood. I mean, these things are only possible by a man. They are not possible outside of mankind. And Jesus Christ himself never became an angel, right? The second person of the Trinity, God became a man. He became incarnate so that you and I could possess him within ourselves, that he would clean out the inside of us and that he would dwell within us. This is, God's ultimate, normalcy is that man would become like a great saint. Like what we read in the book of Acts is not abnormal. It just seems abnormal because we're all, myself included, extremely pathetic. But the reality is that like God's intention is for all of us to become, great saints. Like that's his intention, is that all of us become like his son. That this is the whole purpose of being a Christian, right? Is to become Christ-like. Not in a way that we are seeking after our own glory. Remember, the devil, he's always seeking after his own glory. And that the devil would never glorify God. He's always seeking after his own glory. And the other thing is, the devil is always trying to tell people that he will make them like God. This is the temptation in the Garden of Eden, right? He says, you will become like God. This is the temptation. All of the occult, all of witchcraft, all of everything that you see in other religions is trying to elevate man above himself. That's the whole temptation for all of us. But it's self-deification, that the devil will give the person the power that they need to become godlike. And the irony is, for the Christian, he finds out that he is so weak and inept, he has to have Jesus Christ dwelling within him. But then when Christ dwells within him, he becomes like Christ. But not to his own glory, because he doesn't think of himself as anything, right? I mean, look at St. Paul. St. Paul literally says, I am the greatest of all sinners. And he says, I am the least of the brethren. Like St. Paul did not think that he was some superhero of the New Testament, right? St. Paul knew exactly who he was and was tormented by his own weakness and his own sin. In fact, right, his begging Christ to remove the thorn in his flesh, the messenger of Satan, was to take away his weakness. And what's Christ's response to him? My power is made perfect in weakness, right? My grace is sufficient, for power is made perfect in weakness. The whole life of the Christian is not to become like some, incredible superhero type person. The whole path of the Christian is to become completely humbled and debased, and to think of yourself as nothing. And in this humility, to allow the grace of God to come and dwell within you. This is what we mean when we talk about deification. In fact, probably the most perfect example of this is in the writings of Saint Simeon, the New Theologian. No, take that back. It's in Saint Gregory Palamas. In Saint Gregory Palamas, he says, basically men, when they're in the Holy Spirit, will see things that are happening a ways off as if they're happening right near them. And they'll see the future. And they will like know things, inexplicable things, and many spiritual realities will be revealed to them. But he said it's like a man who is staring into the light and he sees particles of dust. He's not enamored by the dust because he's looking into the light. And so the saints, you read these stories with saints, and like people were healed. People were healed by their prayers. There are, the saints in the book of Acts traveled long distances, and there were saints today who have been known to travel long distances. People are told their future or given a word from God, a moment of instruction. All of these same things, right? Look, Christ says, "You will do greater things than I." This is Christ's instruction. And so when Christians experience these things, it's not the point. The point of the Christian faith is not miracles and this or that thing. The point of the Christian faith is to become completely enamored with Jesus Christ. And by the indwelling of the Holy Spirit, we know when we have Christ living within us, especially us Orthodox Christians who receive his body and blood, we become Christ-like, but all we care about is being Christ-like. And in fact, there's a beautiful story with one of my favorite saints. I named one of my sons after him. His name is St. John Maximovich. And he was in a hospital in San Francisco. And this was in the 20th century. I knew people who actually knew him personally. In fact, one of the families that I knew, her uncle, I believe it was tuberculosis he had, and it was a death sentence at the time. This was, I think, in the 1940s or 30s. And the nurses told the family, they told them, "Look, your son is going to die." And they called St. John, who was the bishop there in San Francisco. And St. John came in and prayed over him and said, "He'll be fine." And he miraculously recovered and he didn't die. And they had never, there was no medicine at the time. This was like an incurable disease. But there's a story of him being in the hospital, and he says to a person, he was very fond of this. He would walk in there after the celebration of the resurrection. He would go visit the people in the hospital who couldn't make it to church. But he would say to different people in the hospital, he would say, "Christ is risen." And this is what we say on our, we don't call it Easter, we call it Pascha because it's celebration of the Passover. And we say, "Christ is risen." The other person says, "Truly he is risen." And he said to some person in the hospital, "Christ is risen." And she was healed, miraculously healed from her illness that she was in the hospital for. And she found out and found St. John, and she said, "I want to become Orthodox." And he said, "Why do you want to become Orthodox?" And she said, "Because when you spoke to me, Christ is risen in the hospital, I was healed." And he said, "That's not a good enough reason to become Orthodox."
Oh,
He said, you become an Orthodox for Jesus Christ, not because I healed you. And so the whole emphasis on the Christian life is not just to become, Christ-like or to become God-bearing in and of ourselves or for our own glory or to our own satisfaction. The whole purpose is for the Christian life is to become like Christ, to become intimate with him, and just on more and more deeper and more profound levels. It's never ending. It's never ending. Look, the intimacy that I have with my wife after 20 years, right, is much deeper. The relationship is much more profound. After you go through many hardships and difficulties, the love and the relationship, everything is much more deep, much more profound, much more loving. But it is like a drop in the ocean compared to knowing Jesus Christ. It is nothing compared to knowing Christ. I could forgive me, but in a sense, I could live without my wife. I cannot live without Jesus Christ. My relationship with him is fundamental to my very existence. So,
man, and I love how, like, going back to what you said earlier, is pretty heavy for me because, like you said, when you're young and you're 18, you were just trying to get closer to Jesus. That's it. You weren't looking for you say, "I didn't have any angles." You're just trying it out. You're going, "I just want to get more intimate with the Lord."
yeah.
That's huge to me. That is so, and that's huge to me personally, man, because I see, even with myself, like my pride gets involved a lot. And I want to go, well, for whatever angle, whatever angle I come up with and my pride and my mind comes up with, and not, I don't care if I'm wrong. I don't care if I have to, if I'm learning something new or whatever, because all I really want to do is get more intimate with Jesus. Or like you said, you wanted to get back what you had in that boys camp when it was like the worst possible circumstances, and you had these little bursts of peace, and there was no doubt where that came from. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Because how are you gonna?
Yeah, it's the peace of Christ that transcends all understanding, as St. Paul says. I mean, that's what it is.
It's just so cool, man. Because to me it shows that you didn't like. You know what I'm trying to say? It shows that you were being real. Like it doesn't matter, because all you really wanted to do is get close to Jesus, and this is where it led you. You know what I mean? Like, that's amazing to me. Probably because I'm so prideful, bro. I'm like the most prideful guy ever, and I've had to learn the hard way.
I mean, seriously, I'm glad that you guys enjoy having this conversation, because sometimes, I talk to people and they want to debate a theology or about this or about that or whatever. And like, I'm well versed. I'm happy to talk, but like, so often it's about stuff. It's not really about Christ, and this is like, like, this is the whole substance for me, right? The whole substance for me is like, I've been Orthodox Christian now for 15 years. It's the most profound, best decision of my entire life, bar none. There's nothing that compares to it. Why? Because I know Christ more. I'm more healed. I know him more. I'm more in his presence. Whatever you want to say, just on and on and on. But it's him. It's not because like, oh, this is traditional Christianity, or like, I need you to affirm me and I have this new identity. And you know what I mean? Like, I never was big on that. I never felt like I needed other people's, per se, their affirmation to define me. Like, I didn't, like, if you don't like it or you don't accept it, like, I've always been like, I don't care. It doesn't matter to me. And then this area, like, I'm like, it's very hard to talk to people sometimes, because they're like, they're very,
like,
they want to be right. They want to be right. And they want to tell me like, oh, your orthodoxy cannot be right because this, and this reason, or because I'm this, and because this is a threat to it. And I'm like, listen, all I'm telling you is like, this is reality. This is really what happened to my life. Like, I don't have another answer. I don't have another story to tell, It's just the way that it is. It's just the way that it is. I was talking with the priest not even that long ago, and he said he wasn't even looking to become Orthodox. And he had a dream, a miraculous vision. He saw a saint in it. And the saint started telling him all about his life. And he was like, and I was like, this is how you became Orthodox? He's like, this is how I became Orthodox. And he's like, I woke up. He's like, I